Welcome to StorySeeker, exploring the world, one story at a time. Today, let's listen to the story of The Secret Garden, a journey of friendship, healing, and the magic of nature. Mary Lennox was the sort of child people tried to avoid. She wasn't charming or sweet, and she certainly wasn't someone anyone would miss. With a thin little body, pale yellow skin, and eyes that always seemed to scowl, Mary looked like a girl who had never smiled in her life. Because, truthfully, she hadn't. She had been born in India, in a hot, dusty house where her parents were far too busy with themselves to care for a child. Her father worked for the British government, always ill, always distracted. Her mother was known for her beauty and parties, not for tenderness or love. In fact, she didn't want a child at all. When Mary was born, she was handed off immediately to an ayah, a native nursemaid with strict instructions. Keep the child quiet. Keep her out of sight. Don't let her disturb the Mem Sahib. And so, from the very beginning, Mary was raised by servants who feared the wrath of their employer more than they cared about the child they were raising. The ayah and the other servants gave Mary whatever she demanded. If she screamed, she was fed. If she threw a tantrum, she was given toys. If she sulked, she was left alone. By the time she was 6, Mary had learned one truth. If she wanted something, she could get it by being unpleasant. She was a sour, bossy little thing, quick to slap, quick to shout, and impossible to please. Even the English governesses who were brought in to teach her didn't stay long. They came, they frowned, and they left. None lasted more than a few months. And yet, nobody seemed to care. Mary never played with other children. She never had anyone tuck her into bed. She never once heard someone say they loved her. So she never learned how to be kind, or soft, or joyful. She wasn't kind. She wasn't joyful. She was alone. One morning, when Mary was about 9 years old, something strange happened. She woke up feeling angry, which wasn't unusual, but something else was different too. The woman standing beside her bed was not her ayah. "Why did you come?" Mary demanded, sitting up sharply. "I don't want you. I want my ayah. Send her to me now." The strange woman looked frightened. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "Your ayah cannot come, Missy Sahib." Mary narrowed her eyes. "Why not?" she barked. "I'll beat you if you don't send her." But the woman only backed away, repeating quietly, "It is not possible. The ayah cannot come." Something was wrong. There was a strange feeling in the house, an eerie stillness. The usual sounds of morning clattering dishes, low conversations, hurried footsteps were missing. Some of the servants were simply gone. Others moved quickly, with pale, frightened faces. No one explained anything, and no one came for Mary. Eventually, angry and restless, she wandered out into the garden. She sat beneath a tree and began poking at the dirt with a stick, pretending to plant a garden of her own. She stuck bright hibiscus flowers into piles of earth, all the while muttering insults under her breath. "Pig," she hissed. "Daughter of pigs. All of them." She was grinding her teeth when she heard voices nearby, her mother's voice, and a man's. Mary froze. She rarely saw her mother up close. The Mem Sahib was a distant figure, elegant, laughing, always in silk and lace, smelling like perfume and powder. Mary stared. But this morning, her mother looked different. Her fine gown fluttered in the wind. Her golden hair was slightly undone, and her face, usually painted with smiles, was filled with fear. "Is it so very bad?" she whispered to the young officer beside her. "Oh, is it truly that bad?" "Awfully," the man replied, his voice tight. "Mrs. Lennox, you should have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago. It's dangerous now." I know," she cried, wringing her hands. "I stayed for that stupid dinner party. What a fool I was." At that moment, a loud, heart-wrenching wail rose from the servants' quarters. It was the sound of grief, wild, uncontrollable. Mrs. Lennox gasped and clutched the officer's arm. Mary shivered. Something terrible was happening. "What is it? What's happened?" her mother cried. "Someone has died," said the officer. "It's the servants. The cholera, it's spreading fast." Then, without another word, Mrs. Lennox turned and ran back into the house. Mary Lennox did not cry when her mother died. In truth, she barely noticed her absence. She had never truly known her mother, only admired her from afar, like a stranger admiring a portrait. Her mother had been beautiful, yes, but distant. And Mary, a self-centered child raised by servants, gave little thought to anything beyond herself. She was sent first to the home of an English clergyman and his wife, a modest house already crowded with 5 quarrelsome children. Mary hated every moment there. The children bickered, wore shabby clothes, and didn't treat her like a princess. Within days, she was left alone to play by herself under a tree, building imaginary gardens out of dirt and rocks. That's when Basil, one of the clergyman's sons, came over. He was cheeky, with bright blue eyes and a nose that turned up like he always had something to say. "Why don't you put a pile of stones here and pretend it's a rockery?" he asked, pointing curiously. Mary glared. "Go away. I don't want boys near me." Basil wasn't offended. He laughed and began to tease her, dancing in circles, singing loudly. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells, and marigolds all in a row." The other children joined in, laughing. Mary fumed, and from that day forward, they called her Mistress Mary, quite contrary to her face and behind her back. Soon after, Basil announced with a smirk, "You're going away next week. We're glad." "So am I," Mary snapped. "Where is home, anyway? You don't even know. It's England, stupid. You're going to live with your uncle. His name is Mr. Archibald Craven." Mary didn't like the sound of that. A few days later, when Mrs. Crawford confirmed she'd be sent to England to live at Misselthwaite Manor, Mary showed no emotion. She turned her face away when kissed, stood stiffly when spoken to, and refused to be touched. "She is such a plain child, Mrs. Crawford said afterward, shaking her head. "And her mother was such a lovely woman. No wonder the children nicknamed her Mistress Mary, quite contrary." With no one else willing to escort her, Mary travelled under the care of an officer's wife. But that woman had her hands full with her own children, and gladly handed Mary off to the woman who came to collect her in London, Mrs. Medlock. Mrs. Medlock was a stout, no-nonsense woman with sharp black eyes and very red cheeks. Her purple dress was loud, her bonnet overdone, and her tone brisk. Mary disliked her immediately, but then again, she rarely liked anyone. "She's a plain little thing, isn't she?" Mrs. Medlock remarked carelessly. "Not much of her mother in her, that's for sure." "Maybe she'll grow into her looks," someone said kindly. "She'll have to grow a lot first," Mrs. Medlock replied. Mary stood by the hotel window, watching the cabs pass by, pretending not to hear. The next day, they set off by train for Yorkshire. Mary sat silently, hands folded in her lap, black dress stiff and proper, yellow face peeking beneath a black crepe hat. She looked out the window and said nothing. Mrs. Medlock, tired of the silence, eventually spoke. "I suppose I should tell you about where you're going. Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No," Mary replied curtly. "Well, he's different. Lives in a great gloomy old house out on the moor. 600 years old, they say. Nearly 100 rooms, though most are locked. Furniture, pictures, long hallways. And gardens, though. Well, you'll see." Mary said nothing. She stared out at the grey landscape. "Your uncle's not one for company," Mrs. Medlock continued. "He's got a crooked back and a sour temper. Lost his wife years ago. Since then, he's barely spoken to anyone." Mary perked up slightly. "He was married?" "Aye. She was lovely. Too lovely for him, some said. But she loved him, oddly enough. When she died, he shut himself away. Keeps to the West Wing now. Only picture sees him, he's the old servant who's been with him forever." Mary didn't reply, but something in the story stayed with her. Rain streaked the train windows, matching the greyness inside her heart. Misselthwaite Manor, with its locked doors and hidden wings, sounded like a place out of a Gothic novel. And the man who waited there, a crooked figure buried in sorrow, was now her guardian. Mrs. Medlock gave her final warning. "Don't expect anyone to entertain you. You'll be told where you can go and where you can't. There are gardens, at least. But in the house, stay out of trouble. Mr. Craven won't have it." Mary didn't answer. She turned her face toward the stormy window, and as the rain blurred the landscape into grey smudges, she drifted into uneasy sleep. Mary Lennox had never seen a place like this before. After sleeping through much of the train ride, she awoke to find herself in a world that was dark, damp, and unfamiliar. The rain was still falling steadily, and the carriage rocked gently as it moved. Mrs. Medlock had bought a basket of food from one of the stations, and they shared cold chicken, slices of beef, thick bread, and hot tea. Mary ate in silence, her fingers warming on the tin cup. The rhythm of the rain and the soft sway of the train lulled her back to sleep. By the time she opened her eyes again, it was night. The train had come to a stop, and Mrs. Medlock was gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up, child. This is Thwaite Station. We've still got a long way to go." Mary blinked the sleep from her eyes. She didn't reach for any parcels back in India. Servants had always done that. She merely followed, watching as Mrs. Medlock handled everything. Outside, the air was cold and wet. A carriage waited, and the driver and footman were both dressed in long waterproofs, glistening under the station lights. The station master exchanged a few words with Miss Medlock in a thick Yorkshire accent that Mary couldn't quite follow. They climbed into the carriage, which was well cushioned and warm. Mary settled into a corner, gazing out the window as the village slipped past in shadowy blurs. There were a few lights in cottage windows, the flicker of a fire here and there, a church, and a vicarage. Soon, even those disappeared. "What is a moor?" Mary asked suddenly. "You'll see it soon enough," Mrs. Medlock replied. "We've 5 miles to drive across Missel Moor. It's wild land. You won't see much tonight, but you'll feel it." Mary leaned her forehead against the cold glass. The road grew rougher. Trees vanished. Darkness stretched out endlessly in every direction. Then came the sound, a low, mournful wind sweeping across the open land. "We're on the moor now," Mrs. Medlock said. Mary peered into the night. It looked like an ocean of shadows. "It sounds like the sea," she murmured. "Just the wind through the heather and gorse. Not much grows out here. You'll find a few wild ponies, maybe sheep, but it's mostly empty." They rode on. The wind whistled through dips in the road, and twice they crossed small stone bridges with rushing water below. Mary sat silent. The moor made her feel small, lonely. Eventually, a dim light appeared in the distance. Mrs. Medlock sighed with relief. "That's the lodge. We'll be there soon." They passed through tall iron gates and continued along a winding drive flanked by overhanging trees. Their branches formed a canopy that turned the path into a tunnel. Then, finally, the house emerged from the shadows, long and low, made of grey stone, sprawling like a sleeping beast across the land. Most of its windows were dark. Only one, far up in a corner, glowed faintly. The carriage stopped. Mary stepped down into the chill. The door they approached was enormous, thick oak bound with iron. Inside, the entrance hall was cavernous and dim. The walls were lined with portraits and suits of armor, their faces ghostly in the low light. The scent of age and dust lingered. A thin, sharp-faced man greeted them. "Take her to her rooms," he told Mrs. Medlock. "Mr. Craven does not wish to be disturbed. He departs for London in the morning." "Very well," Mrs. Medlock replied. "I'll see to it." They ascended a grand staircase, turned down long hallways, up a flight of narrow stairs, and through another corridor. The silence of the manor was heavy. Finally, they reached a small suite of rooms. A fire burned in the grate, and a tray of supper waited on a table. "These are your rooms," Mrs. Medlock said briskly. "You'll stay here. Don't go wandering. Mr. Craven won't have it." Mary didn't answer. That night, as wind howled outside and the fire cast flickering shadows on the stone walls, Mary Lennox sat alone in the strange house. The silence pressed in around her, vast and unfamiliar. And though she wouldn't have admitted it aloud, she felt a strange tightness in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something colder, something lonelier. Misselthwaite Manor wasn't just a house. It was a world apart. And for the first time in her life, Mary felt truly alone. But somewhere deep in that shadowed house, something was waiting. Something no one had spoken of. Something locked and hidden. And the wind, curling past stone and window pane, seemed to whisper that it was listening. When Mary Lennox opened her eyes the next morning, the first thing she saw was a girl on her knees by the fireplace, noisily raking out the cinders. It wasn't the quiet efficiency she was used to in India, it was full of clatter and purpose. Mary lay still, watching. The room itself was strange to her, with thick tapestry on the walls embroidered with forest scenes. Hunters, horses, elegant ladies in flowing gowns, and the distant towers of a castle. It felt like waking up inside a storybook. Beyond the window, the land stretched on, and on a pale, purplish-brown expanse that looked like a sea without water. "What is that?" Mary asked, pointing. The girl looked up. She was round-faced, rosy-cheeked, and sturdy. "That there? That's the moor," she said cheerfully, her accent thick with Yorkshire. "Do you like it?" "No," Mary replied flatly. "I hate it." "That's 'cause you're not used to it yet," the girl said, returning to her work. "But you'll come to like it. It's full o' growing things, and when the gorse and heather bloom, it smells like honey." Mary studied her. This girl was nothing like the silent, obedient servants back in India. She talked, freely, boldly, as if she weren't afraid at all. "You're a strange servant," Mary said stiffly. The girl laughed. I know. I'm Martha. Mrs. Medlock gave me the job out o' kindness. I'm to do your housemaid's work and see to you a bit, but I'm not the lady's maid sort. Too common. Talk too much. Are you going to dress me? Mary asked, still in her haughty voice. Martha paused. Dress yourself, can't you? No. My ayah always did it. Well, it's time you learned, said Martha. You'll feel better for it. And so Mary dressed herself clumsily, angrily, but she did it. The clothes weren't the black ones she had worn before. These were soft and warm, with colour in them. Mr. Craven said he wouldn't have a child in black, wandering about like a lost soul, Martha explained. Said colour would cheer the place up a bit. Mary said nothing, but secretly, she liked the coat. At breakfast, Mary refused her porridge. Martha gaped. Thou doesn't want thy porridge? My brothers and sisters would have licked the bowl clean. I'm not hungry, Mary said coolly. Then Thar needs fresh air, Martha said, putting a coat and boots in her arms. Go out and play. It'll give thee an appetite. Outside, the gardens were bare and wintry. Trees stood like skeletons. Flower beds were patches of frozen earth. Still, Mary wandered. She came upon walled gardens, one leading into another. Then she saw it a wall with no open door, only the top of a tree peeking above. A robin with a bright red breast perched on its highest branch and burst into song. Something about it made Mary pause. It didn't sound like India. It didn't sound like loneliness. She followed the bird, curious, and found herself speaking aloud to it. Would you make friends with me? Her voice was softer than she realized. The gardener, Ben Weatherstaff, grunted when she approached. He was surly, with a weathered face and few words. But when he saw the robin, his face changed. He whistled softly, and the bird flew to him. He's been my friend since he were a fledgling, he said. Came from the garden with the locked door. Mary's eyes widened. What garden? Ben hesitated. Mr. Craven. Shut it up 10 years ago. Buried the key. Mary stared at the wall. But there must be a door. If there is, Ben said gruffly, it's not for thee to find. And with that, he turned and walked away. But Mary stayed behind, eyes fixed on the robin and the wall beyond. Something was hidden there, something no one wanted her to see. And for the first time since arriving at Misselthwaite, she wanted to see it more than anything in the world. Each day that passed in Misselthwaite Manor was almost the same for Mary Lennox. She woke in her strange, tapestry-covered room to the sound of Martha clattering by the hearth. She ate breakfast in the nursery, which held no toys or laughter, and then, not knowing what else to do, she went outside. She didn't realize how good this was for her. The moor's wild air filled her lungs, and though she hated the cold wind that pushed against her, she began to run. Not for fun, just to keep warm, but that running stirred something in her. Her cheeks grew pinker, her eyes brighter. Her stiff limbs began to loosen. After several days outdoors, she woke one morning with a strange sensation. Hunger. For the first time in her life, she ate her porridge without complaint. "Tha got on well enough with that this morning, didn't tha?" Martha said with a grin. "It tastes nice today," Mary admitted. "That's the air o' the moor. Gives thee an appetite," Martha replied. "Our cottage had 12 mouths and oft not enough porridge to go round." Mary said nothing. She had never thought much about hunger before. In India, meals had simply appeared. Here, everything seemed earned. She still had nothing to play with, but she walked and she watched. Sometimes she saw Ben Weatherstaff, but he barely looked at her. Once, when she tried to approach, he turned his back. One place called her back again and again. The long walk outside the walled gardens. Most of the ivy was trimmed, but at one section, it grew thick and wild. She wondered why. One morning, as she stared at the overgrown wall, a flash of red caught her eye. The robin. "Is it you?" she called, smiling, and it chirped back as if in answer. Mary laughed aloud. She didn't even notice how much prettier she looked with laughter in her eyes. She ran along the path, chasing the robin as it flitted from branch to branch. She even tried to chirp back, not knowing how to whistle. The bird didn't mind. It flew to the top of a tree inside the locked garden wall. "It's in there," Mary whispered. "The garden without a door. I'm sure of it." She searched the walls again, circling through the kitchen gardens, the orchard, and back along the path. Still no door. "Very queer," she murmured. "There must have been one." Mr. Craven buried the key. That evening, as she sat warm by the fire, she asked Martha the question that had been growing in her mind. Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden? Martha hesitated, then sat down beside her on the hearth. "He don't like us to speak of it," she said, voice low. "But I suppose it's not a wicked thing to tell. It were his wife's garden. She made it herself, grew roses and all kinds of lovely things. He loved her, and she loved the garden. They spent hours in it, just the two of them." Martha paused. Then one day, she was sitting on an old tree seat she'd trained roses over. The branch broke. She fell. Next day, she died. Mary was quiet. He locked the door and buried the key, and no one's been in since. Mary didn't ask more. The fire glowed red, and the wind outside howled louder. Martha called it wuthering, a word Mary didn't know, but now understood. It sounded like the moor was alive, battering the stone walls, trying to get in, but inside it was warm, safe, and something was changing in Mary. 4 things had already changed. She had run in the wind, felt real hunger, laughed with a bird, and most strange of all, felt sorry for someone else. Just as she was thinking this, she heard something. It was faint like the wind, but not the wind. She turned to Martha. "Do you hear someone crying?" Martha stiffened. "No," she said quickly. "It's the wind. Sounds like crying sometimes." "No," Mary insisted. "It's in the house, down one of the corridors." And then came a sudden gust. A door slammed open. The candle blew out, and through the rush of wind came the unmistakable sound of a child sobbing. Mary and Martha both stood, frozen. "There," Mary said. "I told you. Someone's crying and it's not a grown-up." Martha ran to the door, locking it. "It's the scullery maid, Betty," she said. "She's had the toothache all day," but her voice was nervous. Her hands trembled. Mary didn't believe her. She could see it in Martha's face. Someone was crying in the corridors of Misselthwaite Manor, and Mary intended to find out who. The next morning, rain lashed against the windows, and the moor outside was shrouded in mist. There would be no walking today. "What do you do when it rains like this?" Mary asked Martha, as the girl raked the hearth. "Try to keep from tripping over each other mostly," Martha replied with a grin. "There's 10 of us still living at home. When it's wet, the big ones go out to the cowshed to play. Dickon don't care if it's raining, he's always out. Says he sees things in the rain you don't see when it's fine. Once found a fox cub half drowned. Took it home in his shirt to warm it up. Another time he brought home a crow. Named it Soot. Tamed it. Follows him around." Mary didn't mind the chatter anymore. In fact, she rather liked it. The stories of the overcrowded cottage, of the wild moor and strange creatures intrigued her, especially the bits about Dickon. "If I had a fox cub or a crow," she said wistfully, "I'd play with that. But I've nothing." Martha frowned. "Can the knit?" "No." "So?" "No." Read? Yes. Well, why don't you read then? Or learn to spell? You're old enough. I don't have any books. Mine were left in India. Pity that. There's thousands of them in the library if Mrs. Medlock would let thee in. Mary said nothing, but her mind was already moving. If there was a library, maybe she could find it. No one was stopping her from exploring. No one, in fact, seemed to notice her much at all. So when Martha left, Mary slipped into the corridor and began to wander. The house was enormous, a labyrinth of corridors and stairways. Doors lined the halls, some heavy, some simple, all closed. Portraits stared down at her, dressed in velvets and satins, their eyes seeming to follow her movements. Some were children like her, stiff in brocade dresses and ruffles. She passed one long gallery filled with portraits and paused at a picture of a sharp-eyed girl holding a green parrot. "Where do you live now?" she whispered. "I wish you were here." She turned the handle of a door, and to her surprise, it opened. Inside was a grand bedroom, furnished with embroidered hangings and carved furniture. Over the mantel hung the same sharp-eyed girl. Mary shivered. She opened more doors, growing bolder. In one velvet-hung room, she found a cabinet filled with ivory elephants. Some were tiny, others grand. She played with them a long while, then carefully put them back. It wasn't until she was heading back, lost in the corridors, that she heard it again. A sound, a soft, distant, muffled cry. Her heart jumped. "It's nearer than it was," she whispered. She stood still, hand against a tapestry on the wall, and to her shock, the tapestry shifted. Behind it was a hidden door. Before she could move, Mrs. Medlock appeared, keys jangling, her face furious. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, grabbing Mary's arm. "Didn't I tell you?" "I got lost," Mary said, breathless, "and I heard someone crying." "You heard no such thing," Mrs. Medlock barked. "Back to your room. Now, I'll box your ears if I find you wandering again." She marched Mary back and slammed the door. Mary sat on the hearthrug, jaw clenched, her fists tight. "There was someone crying," she whispered. There was. She had heard it twice now, and someday she'd find out who it was. 2 days after the storm, Mary woke up with a start. The world outside her window had changed. "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" she called to Martha. The grey skies were gone, swept clean by the wild winds of the night. Above stretched a sky so blue it looked as though it had been painted fresh. The moor itself was no longer a dreary purple-black, but soft blue, glowing beneath the sunlight. Tiny white clouds floated like tufts of fleece across the wide heavens. "Aye," Martha grinned, kneeling by the hearth. "The storm's blown itself out. Spring's on its way, though it's still a bit off yet." Mary sat up straighter. "I thought it always rained in England." Martha laughed. "Now to the sort. It's sunny more than folks think. Wait till you see the gorse bloom all golden, and the heather turn purple, and butterflies fluttering like petals in the air. You'll want to live on the moor like Dickon does." "Could I ever get there?" Mary asked, her eyes dreamy, fixed on the horizon. Martha paused, then shrugged. "It's 5 miles to our cottage. They's not used to walking, but maybe someday. I'll ask Mother. It's my day out, and I'm going home." "She always finds a way," Mary nodded. "I like your mother. Everyone does," Martha said with quiet pride. "Even folks who've never seen her. I like Dickon too," Mary added. "Well," said Martha, setting down her brush, "even the animals like him. Birds, rabbits, foxes. He's got away with things. I wonder what he'd think o' you." Mary looked down. "He wouldn't like me. No one does," How does the like thisel? Martha asked. Mary blinked. I don't. I never thought about it before. Martha chuckled. Mother once caught me complaining about folk and asked the same. Brought me up sharp. It did. After breakfast, Mary rushed outside. She ran around the garden fountain 10 times to shake off her gloom. The blue sky stretched above Misselthwaite like a great promise, and she tilted her head back, imagining herself drifting on the clouds. She wandered to the kitchen garden, where she found Ben Weatherstaff working with 2 other men. Spring's coming, he said gruffly. Can thee smell it? Mary sniffed. It smells fresh and damp. That's the earth waking up, he said. Soon there'll be green spikes everywhere, crocuses, snowdrops, daffodils. Not like India, eh? Things don't grow in a night here. Mary listened. I'll watch for them. Just then, she heard the soft flutter of wings the robin. He chirped and hopped close, cocking his head, puffing his red chest as if to say, Remember me, you do remember. Mary laughed. You're the prettiest thing in the world. She talked to him, tried to chirp back, and followed him as he fluttered and darted between the shrubs. He was like a bright, living spark. Then, under one of the shrubs in the flower bed, she saw him pause atop a patch of freshly turned earth. Curious, she stepped closer. Something metallic caught her eye, half buried in the soil. She knelt and dug carefully with her fingers. It was an old key, rusty, weather-worn, and cold in her hand. Her heart gave a strange, excited flutter. Maybe, she whispered, it's been buried for 10 years. Maybe it's the key to the garden. She stood, breathless, the key dangling from her fingers, shining faintly in the morning sun, and the robin, perched above her, sang as if he knew a secret. 2 days after the storm, Mary woke up with a start. The world outside her window had changed. Look at the moor! Look at the moor! She called to Martha. The grey skies were gone, swept clean by the wild winds of the night. Above stretched a sky so blue it looked as though it had been painted fresh. The moor itself was no longer a dreary purple black, but soft blue, glowing beneath the sunlight. Tiny white clouds floated like tufts of fleece across the wide heavens. Aye, Martha grinned, kneeling by the hearth. The storm's blown itself out. Spring's on its way, though it's still a bit off yet. Mary sat up straighter. I thought it always rained in England. Martha laughed. Now to the sort. It's sunny more than folks think. Wait till you see the gorse bloom all golden, and the heather turn purple, and butterflies fluttering like petals in the air. You'll want to live on the moor like Dickon does. Could I ever get there? Mary asked, her eyes dreamy, fixed on the horizon. Martha paused, then shrugged. It's 5 miles to our cottage. Tha's not used to walking, but maybe someday. I'll ask Mother. It's my day out, and I'm going home. She always finds a way. Mary nodded. I like your mother. Everyone does, Martha said with quiet pride. Even folks who've never seen her. I like Dickon too, Mary added. Well, said Martha, setting down her brush. Even the animals like him. Birds, rabbits, foxes. He's got away with things. I wonder what he'd think of you. Mary looked down. He wouldn't like me. No one does. How does the like thisel? Martha asked. Mary blinked. I don't. I never thought about it before. Martha chuckled. Mother once caught me complaining about folk and asked the same. Brought me up sharp. It did. After breakfast, Mary rushed outside. She ran around the garden fountain 10 times to shake off her gloom. The blue sky stretched above Misselthwaite like a great promise, and she tilted her head back, imagining herself drifting on the clouds. She wandered to the kitchen garden, where she found Ben Weatherstaff working with 2 other men. "Spring's comin'," he said gruffly. "Can the smell it?" Mary sniffed. "It smells fresh and damp." "That's the earth waking up," he said. "Soon there'll be green spikes everywhere, crocuses, snowdrops, daffodils. Not like India, eh? Things don't grow in a night here." Mary listened. "I'll watch for them." Just then, she heard the soft flutter of wings the robin. He chirped and hopped close, cocking his head, puffing his red chest as if to say, "Remember me? You do remember." Mary laughed. "You're the prettiest thing in the world." She talked to him, tried to chirp back, and followed him as he fluttered and darted between the shrubs. He was like a bright, living spark. Then, under one of the shrubs in the flower bed, she saw him pause atop a patch of freshly turned earth. Curious, she stepped closer. Something metallic caught her eye, half buried in the soil. She knelt and dug carefully with her fingers. It was an old key, rusty, weather-worn, and cold in her hand. Her heart gave a strange, excited flutter. "Maybe," she whispered. "It's been buried for 10 years. Maybe it's the key to the garden." She stood, breathless, the key dangling from her fingers, shining faintly in the morning sun, and the robin, perched above her, sang as if he knew a secret. Mary stared at the old key in her hand. She turned it over and over, deep in thought. She wasn't the kind of child who asked permission. If this really was the key to the locked garden, well, maybe she could find the door. Maybe she could open it. The mystery of the secret garden had worked its way into her mind like a seed pushing through soil. It had been shut up for 10 years. Surely something had changed behind those walls. The idea of discovering it, of stepping inside where no one else had gone for so long, it thrilled her. She imagined herself closing the door behind her, disappearing into her own little world, with no one the wiser. Living in a vast house with 100 locked rooms and nothing to do had awakened her sleeping imagination. The brisk moor air had stirred her mind as much as it stirred her blood. In India, she had always felt languid and uninterested. But here, for the first time in her life, she was curious. She slipped the key into her pocket and went out to the long ivy-covered walk. As always, the thick green leaves concealed everything. She scanned the wall carefully, but saw only ivy, dense and glossy. A little bit of her old sourness crept back in. She was so close, and yet nothing. Still, she tucked the key into her coat pocket and decided she would always carry it, just in case. That morning, Martha returned from her day off with a flushed face and bright spirits. "I got up at 4, she said cheerfully. "It was beautiful birds singing, rabbits scampering, sun rising. A man gave me a ride partway in his cart. Best morning I've had in ages." Her stories poured out baking day with her mother, fresh bread, dough cakes with sugar for the children, laughter by the fire. Even their brother Dickon had declared their cottage fit for a king. "Did you tell them about me?" Mary asked. "That I did," Martha beamed. They were all ears. Wanted to know everything about India. Elephants, black servants. I'll bet they'd love to hear about tiger hunts and camel rides. Mary thought. "I'll tell you more stories next time." Martha grew serious. "Mother's worried though. Says you should have a governess, someone to teach you books, keep you company." I told her Mr. Craven might not hire one for years. "I don't want one," Mary said quickly. "I like being with you." "Well, that's summat," Martha smiled. Then, with a grin, she pulled something from under her apron. "I brought you a present," Mary blinked. "A present? But your family." "A peddler came by," Martha explained. "Had odds and ends. Elizabeth Ellen saw skipping ropes. Mother took 2 pennies from me wages and said, "I'm buying this for that poor child." She held out a bright skipping rope with red and blue handles. Mary stared at it. "What is it for?" "For skipping." "Watch me." Martha took the rope, ran to the center of the room, and began skipping expertly, counting aloud as she went. Mary watched, wide-eyed. "I used to skip 500 times when I was 12, Martha said proudly. "Could I do it?" Mary asked, intrigued. "Course you could. It'll do you good. Mother says fresh air and skipping'll put color in your cheeks." Mary tried. She wasn't good at it. Her arms and legs were weak, but she liked it. She didn't want to stop. Wrapped warm, she headed outside with her new skipping rope. But before she left, she turned back. "Martha, thank you. It was your money." Thou art a queer thing," Martha said, laughing. "If there were our Elizabeth Ellen that have kissed me, do you want me to?" "Nay, not me," Martha chuckled. "But maybe one day, there will. Now run along." Outdoors, Mary skipped and skipped until her face turned pink and her breath came short. The sun was warm, the wind playful. She felt alive. In the kitchen garden, she found Ben Weatherstaff speaking to his robin. She skipped toward them, hoping Ben would notice. He did. "Well, I'll be. Tha's got red in thy cheeks. Maybe tha's not all sour after all." Mary grinned. "I never skipped before. I can only go up to 20. Keep on, lass. Even he's watching thee," Ben said, nodding at the robin. Curious little beggar. Mary skipped through all the gardens, then back to her ivy walk. She tried skipping the entire path. She made it to 30 before stopping to catch her breath. And there was the robin, perched in the ivy. She laughed. "You showed me the key yesterday. Maybe today you'll show me the door." He chirped and fluttered, showing off. And just then, a strong gust of wind swept through, rustling the ivy. A trail of leaves blew back, revealing something round and metal, half hidden. Mary's heart leapt. She rushed forward and pulled the ivy aside. Beneath it was a knob, a door. Hands trembling, she cleared more ivy away. Her fingers found a keyhole. She pulled the old key from her pocket, slid it in, and turned. It stuck, but turned. She looked up and down the walk. No one. Quietly, she pushed open the door and slipped through. Inside, the air felt different. Mary stood still, heart pounding. She was inside the secret garden. It was the sweetest, most mysterious place imaginable. The high walls were tangled with climbing roses, their leafless stems matted thick against the stone. Mary recognized them roses, just like in India. The ground, brown and wintry, was covered with sleeping bushes, possibly more roses. Many had grown so large they were like small trees. Others had scaled real trees, swinging tendrils into curtains and bridges, stretching from one branch to another. No leaves, no flowers, but everything seemed poised, waiting. "How still it is," Mary whispered. "I'm the first to speak here in 10 years. She stepped softly, thankful for the grass underfoot that muffled her steps. She walked beneath grey arches of vines and wondered aloud, "Is it all dead? I hope not." She wished Ben Weatherstaff were there, he would know. But even if the roses were dead, she could come back. The robin fluttered down, chirping and busy as if showing her around his private domain. The silence no longer felt lonely. Mary felt as though she belonged. Her skipping rope still hung from her arm, and after exploring, she began skipping along the grass paths. Soon, she reached a mossy alcove and saw something pushing up from the soil, sharp, pale green points. She knelt. Crocuses, snowdrops, daffodils. They're alive. Delighted, She searched the garden and found more. She pulled away grass and weeds to give them space. Now they can breathe, she whispered, smiling. Time passed unnoticed. She worked until she was warm, throwing off coat and hat. Her cheeks flushed pink, her eyes sparkled. The robin chirped approval from branch to branch. At dinner, Martha was amazed. 2 pieces o' meat and 2 helps o' rice pudding. Mother'll be proud o' what the skip rope's done for thee. Mary told her about the little green tips she had uncovered and asked about the white onion-like bulbs. They're flower bulbs, snowdrops, crocuses, daffodils. Hardy things, they come back every year. Our Dickon knows all about 'em. He whispers to flowers, and they grow, Martha said proudly. Mary's eyes lit up. Would they live without help? Aye, they help themselves. Poor folk plant 'em 'cause they last. There's places full of snowdrops that no one remembers planting. I wish spring was here, Mary sighed. I want to see England bloom. She wished for a spade. If I had a little spade, I could dig like Ben, maybe make a garden. Martha clapped her hands. Mother said the same. Give the child a bit o' earth, she said. Even parsley and radishes would make her happy. How much is a spade? At Thwaite, 2 shillings for a little set. Spade, rake, fork. I have more than that. Mrs. Morrison and Mrs. Medlock gave me pocket money. Martha brightened. Then we'll write Dickon a letter. He'll get the tools and seeds, and he'll come bringing them himself. Mary clutched her hands in joy. I'll see him? I want to see him so much. They composed a letter. Martha dictated. Mary printed carefully. Dear Dickon, Miss Mary has money. Please buy her flower seeds and a garden tool set. Pick easy, pretty ones. She's never planted before and lived in India. She will tell me more stories to tell you. Love, your sister Martha. They put coins in the envelope. Martha promised to send it with the butcher's boy. If I have a spade, Mary whispered, I can help the garden come alive. Later, she asked, can I visit your cottage someday? Martha smiled. Mother asked Mrs. Medlock. She thinks she'll say yes. You can meet Mother and taste her oatcakes. It felt like all the wonderful things were happening at once. Before tea, Mary asked a final question. Has the scullery maid had toothache again? Martha froze. Why? Because I heard crying again down the corridor. No wind today, so it wasn't that. Martha grew uneasy. Don't go listening in corridors. Mr. Craven wouldn't like it. I wasn't listening, Mary said quietly. I just heard. That's the 3rd time. Then the bell rang for tea, and Martha hurried away. Mary sank into a chair, sleepy and content. It's the strangest house anyone ever lived in, she murmured and promptly fell asleep. The next morning dawned fresh and clear, and Mary woke up with a purpose. The memory of the secret garden clung to her like a dream. She longed to return, to see if the little green tips had grown overnight. But before she could sneak away, Martha bustled in, bringing news. Miss Mary, tha's got a visitor comin'. Mary blinked. A visitor? For me? Aye, and not just any visitor. It's our Dickon. He's bringing the things you asked for. Mary's heart skipped. She straightened her dress and hurried downstairs, excitement fluttering in her chest. In the garden, under the pale morning sun, stood a boy. He was about 12, with a round face, sun-browned skin, and bright eyes that seemed to understand more than they let on. Around him fluttered birds. A crow perched on his shoulder. A fox pup sat patiently at his feet. Mary approached slowly. Are you Dickon? He smiled, warm and easy. That I am. Brought the tools and seeds. Martha said tha's startin' a bit o' gardening. Mary nodded shyly. I want to make things grow. Dickon handed her the little spade and fork. These'll do the trick. And here's seeds, larkspur, poppies, pansies, easy growing, pretty too. As they talked, the animals around Dickon stayed close. The fox, his name was Captain, licked Mary's hand. The crow squawked gently. "How do they follow you like that?" she asked. Dickon chuckled. "They know I won't harm 'em, speak to 'em soft, treat 'em kind, they'll stay by." He spoke to the robin in gentle whistles. The bird hopped closer, chirping. Mary couldn't stop smiling. She told Dickon about the hidden garden, but not all of it. Just the robin and the wall covered in ivy. Dickon's eyes twinkled. "I know the wall. There's a feeling about it. Quiet, like it's sleeping." They walked together through the grounds, and when they reached Mary's special walk, she hesitated. "If you found a locked door, would you open it?" Dickon looked thoughtful. "If it were mine to open, aye. If not, I'd wait. But sometimes a garden needs someone to care for it. Else it forgets how to live." Mary looked up at him. She felt he already knew more than he said, but he didn't press. "Will you help me with my garden?" "Course I will. Show me where thou wants to plant. We'll have it bloomin' in no time." And just like that, Mary felt lighter. With Dickon's help, with his seeds and spade and his quiet way of speaking to all living things, the secret garden didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like something waiting to grow. As the sun rose higher, Mary knew she'd found not just a garden but a friend, and the robin sang above them as if he agreed. The days grew longer and the air turned warmer. Mary woke earlier each morning, eager to return to the secret garden. She never told anyone where she went. The key remained hidden in her coat pocket, and the ivy-covered door stayed their shared secret, hers and the robin's. One morning, as she skipped down the garden path with her rope, cheeks pink from the cool spring breeze, she spotted the robin hopping from branch to branch above the wall. He chirped, flitting from ivy to tree, then back again, glancing at her over his wing. "Showin' me something, are you?" she whispered. And sure enough, when she reached the hidden door and pushed it open, the robin flew inside ahead of her, leading her to a spot near the far wall, where a rose bush had once curled up a stone column. Nestled among the ivy and twisted branches was a tiny nest. Mary knelt close, careful not to disturb it. Inside were tiny pale eggs, still and silent. She whispered, "New life, it's waking up." She worked happily that morning. Dickon had shown her how to use her tools gently, how to loosen the soil, pull weeds, and press seeds into the earth with care. He had promised to return soon, and she looked forward to it more than anything else. As she worked, she spoke softly, as if the plants and bulbs were listening. "You've been asleep too long," she said, "but I'm here now, and Dickon's coming. We'll wake you up together." The sun passed overhead, warm and golden, casting long tree shadows across the garden floor. Birds flitted through the branches. Somewhere near the wall, the robin sang a bright little tune, proud of his nest and of the girl he had chosen to trust. That evening, Mary ate with a new hunger. Her face was flushed, her arms speckled with soil, and her heart light. "You look a picture, O health," Martha said. "Mother'll never believe it's the same sour-faced miss from a month ago." Mary only smiled. She didn't say much. She was keeping something wonderful just for herself. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she thought of the nest, the secret door, the seeds sleeping beneath the soil, and Dickon's easy smile. She felt, for the first time, that something inside her was blooming too. And as sleep took her, she whispered into the dark, "Grow, please grow." The wind outside rustled softly through the ivy, like a quiet answer. Mary burst into her room, hair windswept, cheeks glowing. "I've seen Dickon," she exclaimed, barely catching her breath. Martha looked up from the table. "Tha's late, miss, but I knew he'd come. How did you like him?" Mary paused, then said with unusual certainty, "I think he's beautiful." Martha blinked, surprised. "Well, we never thought o' him as handsome. Nose turns up too much. Big mouth too." "I like that," Mary replied. "His eyes are like the sky." Martha beamed. "Mother says he got 'em looking up at clouds and birds so much. They talked about the seeds, the tools, the way Dickon had brought them." Martha asked where she meant to plant them, and Mary hesitated. "I've not asked anyone yet," she admitted. "Do you think Ben Weatherstaff might help me find a quiet corner? Ben's gruff, but he liked Mistress Craven." "He might." Mary's heart skipped with hope. Maybe, just maybe, the secret garden could be hers, even if no one else knew. Then Martha changed the subject. "Mr. Craven came back this morning, says he wants to see ya." Mary's stomach dropped. She had heard he never wanted to see her. She changed into her best dress in silence. Mrs. Medlock appeared, stiff in her finest clothes. "Mr. Craven will see you now," she said. The halls were unfamiliar. They led to a quiet study where a man with crooked shoulders sat before the fire. His face, lined and weary, looked at her with distant eyes. "Come here," he said. Mary stood before him, pale and silent. "You're very thin," he said. "Are they feeding you well?" "Yes," Mary answered, voice small. He rubbed his forehead. "I meant to send a governess or nurse, but I forgot." "Please, don't," Mary said suddenly. "I'm too big for a nurse." He looked at her, almost puzzled. "Do you want anything?" he asked. "Books, dolls, toys?" She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Might I," she said, voice trembling, "have a bit of earth?" He blinked. "Earth? What for?" "To plant seeds, to make things grow." A pause. Then, softly, he said, "You remind me of someone." "Yes, take any bit of earth you want. Make it come alive." Mary stared. "Anywhere?" He nodded. "Yes, play where you like. Just be happy." He rang for Mrs. Medlock. "Let her run wild," he said. "Fresh air, freedom. Let Susan Sowerby visit her. She knows what children need." Back in her room, Mary's face was lit with joy. "He said I could have my garden," she told Martha. "Anywhere I like." She rushed to the hidden door, but Dickon was gone. Only the robin remained, watching her with bright eyes. On a rose bush, something fluttered. A piece of paper, her letter, pinned with a thorn. Crude letters were scrawled beneath a drawing of a nest. "I will come back." Mary pressed the paper to her chest. She believed him. The next morning dawned, with sunlight pouring through the curtains and birds chirping madly outside the windows. Mary woke up feeling light as the spring air. She wanted to go straight to the garden, but a strange sound caught her attention. A soft sobbing, muffled but unmistakable. She paused, heart racing. That sound again, the one she had heard before in the night. It was not the wind. She was sure of it now. She stepped out quietly and followed the corridor, her small feet making no sound on the thick carpet. The sound grew clearer, guiding her like a thread. At the end of a long hallway, a heavy door stood slightly ajar. Mary hesitated, then pushed it open slowly. Inside was a large room filled with heavy furniture, tapestries, and a fire burning low. And on the bed, surrounded by pillows, lay a boy. He was pale, so pale that he seemed made of ivory. His eyes were wide and dark, filled with tears. He turned quickly when he saw her. "Who are you?" he asked sharply. Mary stood still. I'm Mary Lennox. Who are you? I'm Colin Craven. Her heart skipped. Mr. Craven's son, the one no one ever mentioned. Why are you crying? She asked. Because I'm going to die, he said. Mary frowned. Who said that? Everyone. The servants, my doctors, my father. They all think I'll die before I grow up. Mary stepped closer. You don't look like you're dying. You look cross. Colin blinked. Well, I am cross, he admitted. I'm always ill. I have a crooked back. Do you? He shifted uncomfortably. They say I might, that I could become a hunchback like father. So they keep me in here, always in bed, with people tiptoeing around. Mary came closer, her tone firm. You should come outside, into the fresh air. It makes me hungry and strong. You go outside? All the time. On the moor, in the gardens. He looked at her with a mix of suspicion and longing. Tell me about them. And so she did. She told him of the wind, the flowers poking through the earth, and of Dickon, who spoke to animals like old friends. She didn't mention the secret garden, not yet. Colin listened with wide eyes, leaning forward on his pillows. Come again, he said. Come again tomorrow, and bring more stories. Mary nodded. I will. She left the room quietly, the sound of her steps swallowed by the thick silence of the house. Something new stirred inside her. A secret garden, a secret boy, and maybe, just maybe, two lives beginning to bloom. That afternoon, Mary dashed to the garden with her skipping rope in one hand and a smile lighting her face. The moment she stepped through the ivy-covered door, a hush fell over her. Everything felt different. The air was warmer, gentler. The buds on the rose vines seemed a little fuller, the green shoots a little taller. The robin chirped and fluttered nearby, hopping from branch to branch, as if greeting her. Mary dropped to her knees in the soft earth, fingers pressing into the damp soil. She touched each shoot she had uncovered, whispering to them, "Grow, little things. Grow strong." She thought about Colin the boy in the big bed, pale and locked away, convinced he was doomed. He needed fresh air, he needed magic, but he couldn't know. Not yet. The garden was still too secret, too sacred. Then, just as she began clearing a patch of weeds near the wall, she heard the latch click. Her heart leapt. She turned. It was Dickon. He stood in the doorway, hair tousled, a lamb following at his heels. "Thar looks like spring herself," he said, grinning. Mary beamed. "You came back, told that I would." He crossed the grass, pulling from his pocket a handful of seeds. "Found these on the moor, wildflowers. Thought they might like a home here." They planted together in silence, the robin watching from a rosebush. The lamb nosed curiously at the tools, bleated once, then curled under a tree. "Dickon," Mary said softly. "I met Mr. Craven's son today. Colin." Dickon paused. "So it's true then. They said there was a lad but no one sees him. He thinks he'll die." Dickon's eyes darkened with concern. "That's a bad thought for a young lad." Mary nodded. "I want to help him. I want to show him this place, but not yet." "When he's ready," Dickon said, patting the earth gently. "A garden's like that. Can't force nothing. Just wait and care for it. Then it grows." The wind stirred through the branches. Mary closed her eyes and breathed in deep. Everything was changing. Something was blooming in the soil, in Colin's heart, and in her own, and she was ready to see what would grow next. The moon hung high over Misselthwaite Manor, casting silver light across the moor. Inside the great house, all was quiet except for a soft, steady creaking in the long hallway. Mary was awake. Something had stirred her. She tiptoed out, guided by instinct more than reason, her candle flickering in the drafts. There it was again, that same faint crying. She followed it past the tapestry-lined walls until she stood before Colin's door. She knocked once, gently. No answer. Then slowly she pushed it open. Colin lay wide-eyed in bed, his face pale in the candlelight. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. "You're crying again," Mary said, walking to his side. He nodded. "I had a dream that I couldn't walk, that I was trapped forever." Mary sat beside him. "You're not trapped. You just need to be outside. You need to live." His eyes searched hers. "Will you really come again tomorrow?" "Yes," she said firmly. "And the next day, and the next." He hesitated. "There's something strange about you. You don't look frightened of me. Everyone else does." Mary smiled. "That's because I'm not." Colin was quiet for a long moment. Then, timidly, he asked, "Will you tell me another story?" And she did. She told him of the wild moor, of fox cubs and lambs and robins, of things buried in the earth just waiting to grow. When she finally slipped out into the night, the moon was even higher, the hall even quieter, and somewhere behind her, Colin was smiling in the dark. The sun was high when Mary finally remembered Colin. She'd been in the garden all morning, pulling weeds, turning soil, and laughing with Dickon as he spoke to the fox cub and the crow, as if they were old friends. "Tell Colin I can't come now," she told Martha quickly, already halfway back to the hidden door. "I'm busy." Martha looked uneasy. "He's been asking for you since breakfast. Said he'd count the minutes." "Let him count," Mary replied without guilt. "I'll come later." That afternoon, the garden was even more alive. Blossoms trembled on branches, shoots pressed through the damp earth, and the air was soft with birdsong. Mary and Dickon worked side by side, dirt under their nails and joy in their hearts. "Thar's stronger every day," Dickon said, watching her with a proud smile. "I feel stronger," she replied. "Hungrier too, and I'm growing fatter. Martha will need to let out my dresses." They laughed. The rook cawed from a branch, and the fox dozed in a patch of sunlight. Everything felt perfect, but when Mary returned to the house, Martha met her with a worried frown. "He's in a mood, he is," she said. "Didn't take it well when I told him you weren't coming." Mary stiffened. "Why should I drop everything just because he wants me to?" Still, she went to his room. Colin lay in bed, turned away from the door. "Why didn't you come?" he asked without looking at her. "I was working in the garden," Mary answered plainly. He turned his head, eyes flashing. "I won't let Dickon come anymore if you choose him over me," Mary flared. "If you send Dickon away, I'll never come here again. I'll make them bring you, then I'll sit and never speak." They stared at each other, stubborn, furious. Neither used to hearing no, neither willing to bend. "You're selfish," Colin shouted. "So are you," Mary snapped. "Everyone's selfish when they don't get their way. Dickon's selfish. He's better than you'll ever be." It escalated. Colin threw a pillow at her. Mary refused to flinch. "I was going to tell you about the fox and the rook," she said coldly, turning to leave. "Now I won't tell you a thing." Outside the door, the nurse stood giggling behind a handkerchief. "What are you laughing at?" Mary demanded. "At you two," the nurse said. "That row was the best thing to happen to him. Spoiled lad needs someone to stand up to him." Mary marched back to her room, still fuming. But waiting on the table was a wooden box. Inside were beautiful books, games, and a gold-trimmed writing set. "From Mr. Craven," Martha said. "Sent special." Mary blinked, her anger dulled. She hadn't expected such a gift. She picked up the pen. "I'll write to thank him," she murmured. "Later," As she sat on her bed, she thought of Colin, of his tears, his anger, the fear he hid. "I said I wouldn't go back," she whispered. "But maybe I will." The secret garden had opened her heart, and maybe, just maybe, it could open his too. Mary woke in the middle of the night to awful screams echoing through the halls. She sat up, heart pounding. "It's Colin," she whispered. "He's having one of his tantrums." The sound made her shake. She pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. She wanted to hide, but anger welled up instead. Why should he get to scream like that? Why should everyone else have to put up with it? Suddenly, the door burst open. The nurse rushed in, pale and breathless. "He's out of control," she said. "No one can calm him. Will you come? Please." Mary didn't hesitate. She was furious now, furious enough to face him. She stormed down the corridor, flung open his door, and shouted, "Stop it! I hate you. Everyone hates you. I wish they'd all leave you to scream yourself to death." Colin stopped mid-sob, stunned. His red, tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief. "I can't stop," he gasped. "I felt the lump. I'm going to die." "No, you're not," Mary snapped. "You didn't feel anything but your own temper. You're full of hysterics. Turn over. I'll look at your back myself." The nurse hovered, unsure. Colin was still shaking, but he turned. Mary examined his thin back, frowning. "Nothing. Not even a bump the size of a pin. I've got bumps too, we all do. If you say you've got a lump again, I'll laugh at you." Colin blinked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a very small voice, he asked, "Do you think I could live to grow up?" The nurse stepped in, gently. "You might, if you stop giving in to your fears and get fresh air." Colin reached out and caught Mary's hand. "Will you go outside with me? If Dickon comes too?" She nodded. "We'll take you to see everything, even the fox cub and the crow." That night, after the nurse brought them both warm drinks and fluffed the pillows, Colin asked Mary to stay and talk. "Not a story," he said. "Tell me what the garden looks like, the way you imagine it." Mary leaned close. "I think there are roses everywhere, vines on the walls, petals on the grass, birds nesting, daffodils waking up underground, and green spreading slowly like a soft veil." Her voice drifted lower and slower. Colin's eyelids fluttered. He held her hand until sleep took him, a smile just beginning at the corners of his mouth. Mary didn't wake early the next morning. She was tired from the night before, and by the time she stirred, Martha was at her side with breakfast. "Colin's asking for thee," Martha said. "He's quiet, but feverish. Wants to see thee when you've eaten." Mary hesitated. "I'll go. I know what to tell him." She dressed quickly and slipped into Colin's room. He looked pale, with dark circles under his eyes. "Are you going somewhere?" he asked, noticing her hat. "Just to see Dickon," she said, leaning close. "But I'll come back. It's something about the garden." His eyes lit up. "I dreamed of it. Green leaves and birds nesting. Tell me everything when you return." Mary hurried to the secret garden. Dickon was already there with his animals and 2 new friends, squirrels named Nut and Shell. "Jump brought us over," Dickon said, nodding at the pony grazing nearby. They sat beneath a tree while Mary told him all about Colin's change. Dickon's face grew thoughtful. "We've got to get him outside," he said. "Sunshine and spring air will do him more good than anything. We munnot waste no time." Mary smiled. "Aye, that we mun," she said, trying her best Yorkshire. Back at Misselthwaite, Colin sniffed the air when she returned. "You smell like flowers, like spring. What is it?" "It's the moor wind," she said. smells of trees and sunshine and creatures. She spoke in broad Yorkshire, making Colin laugh out loud. They laughed together until Mrs. Medlock peeked in and stood stunned by the sound. They talked about Dickon and his animals. Mary told him about Jump the pony and how Dickon spoke to every creature like a friend. Colin was quiet for a moment. "I wish I was friends with things," he said. "You are starting with me," Mary said. Colin reached out. "I'm glad you came, and I'm sorry I said to send Dickon away. Maybe he is like an angel." Mary grinned. "A Yorkshire angel, maybe. One that smells of the earth and can speak to foxes." Then she grew serious. "Colin, can I trust you? For sure, for sure." "Yes," he whispered. "Dickon's coming to see you tomorrow, with all his animals. But that's not all. I found the door to the garden. It's real." Colin gasped, eyes wide. "Will I see it? Will I live to get into it?" Mary squeezed his hands. "Of course you will. Don't be silly." Then she told him everything. Not just what she imagined, but what she had truly seen. Colin listened, spellbound. "It's just like I dreamed," he whispered. "You really found it." Mary nodded. "Weeks ago, I was afraid to tell you, but now I'm not." Smile, just beginning at the corners of his mouth. Dr. Craven didn't arrive at Misselthwaite until late the next afternoon. He was expecting the usual scene. Colin lying pale and furious, everyone walking on eggshells. Instead, Mrs. Medlock met him with wide eyes. "You'll scarcely believe your own," she said. "That plain little girl has worked a miracle." He's laughing, talking, sitting up in bed with a garden book. When Dr. Craven stepped into the room, he paused in shock. Colin was upright, animated, excitedly naming flowers to Mary. "Those blue ones, we'll have loads of those. Delphiniums. Dickon says they're just fancy larkspurs," Mary added, beaming. Dr. Craven recovered his composure and approached. "I'm glad to see you feeling better, my boy," he said. Colin gave a regal nod. "I'm going out in my chair. Soon. If the weather's fine. My cousin will come with me." "And the nurse?" "No. Just Mary. And a strong boy will push the chair." "Who?" "Dickon," Mary said. Dr. Craven's tension eased immediately. "Ah, if it's Dickon, you'll be quite safe." Colin looked up from his book. "Mary made me better. She made me forget I was ill." Dr. Craven could hardly argue with that. That night, Colin slept deeply and peacefully. And when morning came, something inside him felt light, unburdened. Not even knowing why, he smiled. And then Mary burst in, glowing with excitement. "You've been out," he cried. "You smell like fresh leaves." "It's here, Colin. Spring. This time it's really here." She flung open the window and the scent of earth and blossoms poured in. Birds sang. Sunlight warmed the floor. Colin breathed deeply. Again and again. It felt like magic. "Dickon's coming," Mary said, eyes shining. "With his lamb, and the crow, and the fox." Colin sat up. All of them, even the squirrels. "And the lamb will sit on your lap." When Dickon finally entered, arms full of life, Colin just stared. The lamb nestled into his robe and nuzzled. Dickon fed it from a bottle. Colin was enchanted. "What's it doing?" "Looking for milk. It misses its mother." Colin gently touched the lamb's head. And then the questions poured out about the lamb, the garden, the wild things. Dickon answered them all with quiet joy. "You'll see the columbines," he said. "Big blue and white ones, like fluttering butterflies." "I'm going to see them," Colin said, his voice full of wonder. "And we munnot waste no time." Rain and wind kept them inside for a week, and then Colin nearly caught a cold. But even stuck indoors, there was excitement. Every day, Dickon visited, even if just for a few minutes, to tell of blooming hedges and nesting birds, of fox tracks and mossy dens. Spring was arriving like a secret parade. "They're busy like us," he said, building homes and looking after their own. But the biggest secret of all was the plan to sneak Colin out. No one must see them heading toward the garden wall. It was Colin's idea to make it seem ordinary. They'd stroll past the flower beds, take a meandering path, vanish into the shrubbery, and then magic. At last, the day came. That morning, Colin summoned the head gardener. "No one is to be near the long walk this afternoon," he ordered grandly. "We require privacy." Mr. Roach nodded solemnly. "Very good, sir." When they left Colin's room, the boy was glowing. "It's all safe now," he said. "This afternoon I'll be in it." Dickon returned to the garden with his animals, while Mary stayed with Colin. He was quiet but calm, his thoughts far away. "What are you thinking?" Mary asked. "About spring. I don't think I've ever truly seen it. Not like this." They talked of garlands and parades, and of trumpets and flutes announcing the season. Colin laughed softly. It felt good. That afternoon, wrapped in rugs, Colin was carried down to his chair. Dickon waited with a steady hand, and Mary walked beside them. The sky was endless blue. The air tasted of gorse and new leaves. Colin lifted his face, eyes wide, breathing deep. It felt like he was waking up for the first time in his life. No one saw them slip through the gardens. They followed their path around beds, into green tunnels, and at last, the ivy-covered wall. "This is it," Mary whispered. "Where I heard the robin, where I found the key." Dickon pushed the chair forward. Mary pulled aside the ivy. Behind it, the door waited. "Push me in," Colin whispered. Dickon obeyed, and then they were inside. Colin covered his eyes with shaking hands, held them there a moment, then dropped them. Everything was green and gold. Buds and blossoms, vines and birds. Light streamed through petals and branches. The earth was alive. Colin stared. Then suddenly, he shouted, "I shall get well. I shall live forever and ever and ever." Sometimes, the world feels so full of life and light that it makes you certain you'll live forever. Colin felt that certainty as the garden opened itself to him for the first time. Everything bloomed. The trees flowered in pink and white. Bees hummed. Birds chirped. It was a day so beautiful even Dickon, who knew the moor like the back of his hand, said he'd never seen one quite like it. "I'm 12 going on 13, he said, "and I never had an afternoon as gradely as this." They wheeled Colin beneath a snow-white plum tree, its blossoms like fairy lace, its branches humming with bees. Mary and Dickon showed him buds and leaves, bits of feather and shell. It was like a royal tour of a magic kingdom, and Colin was the enchanted prince. "Will we see the robin?" Colin asked. "Aye, we will," said Dickon. "He'll be flying back and forth soon, feeding his young uns." Mary giggled. "Imagine him with worms, not knowing which mouth to fill first." Colin laughed too, trying to keep his voice low. He'd learned the garden's law. Low voices and whispers only. Even laughter must be quiet. Later, they rested. Dickon drew out his pipe. Colin noticed a nearby tree, old and grey, its large branch broken. "That one's dead, isn't it?" he asked. Dickon's voice softened. "Aye, but when the roses cover it, it'll look the liveliest of all." Colin was about to ask more when Dickon interrupted, pointing. "Look, the robin." They caught a glimpse of red as the bird darted into the ivy. Colin grinned, taking tea to his wife. "I want tea too." So they arranged it. Soon, a white cloth lay on the grass, covered with toast and crumpets. They ate happily. Birds swooped in for crumbs. The The squirrels ran off with cake. The crow took a crumpet and pecked at it noisily. I don't want this to end, Colin sighed, but I'll come back. Every day. You'll get stronger, Mary said. I'll grow here, he answered. Like everything else, Dickon's eyes twinkled. And one day you'll be walking and digging like any lad. Colin looked hopeful. Do you really think so? For sure, said Dickon. You've got legs of your own, same as others. They shake, Colin admitted. But they're mine. He lay back, thoughtful. The sun began to set, casting golden light across the garden. Everything grew quiet, and then Colin sat up. Who is that man? He whispered. They turned. At the top of the wall, glaring down from a ladder, was Ben Weatherstaff. If I wasn't a bachelor, Ben shouted, and you were my own lass, I'd give you a hidin'. Mary ran toward him. Ben Weatherstaff. It was the robin who showed me the way. Ben sputtered, furious and confused. You blaming your mischief on a robin? He didn't know he was showing me, Mary said. But he did. I can't explain unless you come down from that ladder. Ben stopped, jaw-dropping. He was no longer looking at Mary, he was staring at Colin, being wheeled toward him like royalty. Do you know who I am? Colin asked, regal and commanding. Ben stared. His hands trembled. I, he said hoarsely. Tha's got your mother's eyes. But tha's the poor cripple. I'm not a cripple, Colin shouted. I'm not. Mary stepped forward. There's no lump. I checked myself. Ben's voice cracked. Tha's got no crooked back? No crooked legs. Colin's fury surged. Dickon, help me. With trembling determination, he threw off his rugs. Dickon helped him up, and there, on strong, shaking legs, Colin stood. Ben's mouth fell open. He's as straight as I am, Dickon cried. Ben began to cry, openly and without shame. The lies folk tells, he choked. But thou'll make a man yet. God bless thee. Colin raised his chin. I'm your master when my father is away. This is my garden. You will say nothing. Now go, Mary will bring you in. I want to talk to you. Ben touched his hat. Yes, sir. And down the ladder he climbed, his face still wet with tears. As Ben disappeared over the wall, Colin turned to Mary. Go and meet him, he said. Mary ran across the grass. Colin stood tall, his back straight, scarlet spots on his cheeks. He looked astonishing. I can stand, he declared grandly. I told thee thou could, once thou stopped being afraid, said Dickon. I've stopped. Colin nodded. Then he turned sharply to Dickon. Are you making magic? Dickon grinned. Thou's doin' magic thistle. It's same magic as made these flowers grow. Colin looked down at the crocuses near his feet. Aye, he said softly. There couldn't be bigger magic than that. He straightened. I'm going to walk to that tree. I want to be standing when Weatherstaff returns. With Dickon steadying him, Colin walked. He leaned against the tree, tall and proud. When Ben entered through the ivy door, Mary whispered to herself, You can do it. You can do it. Ben saw Colin. His eyes widened. Colin stared imperiously. Look at me. All over. Am I a hunchback? Have I got crooked legs? Ben blinked. Now to the sort. What's the been doing? Hidden from the world. Everyone thought I was going to die, said Colin. I'm not. Ben stared harder. Tha's got too much pluck for dying. Sit, lad, he added gruffly. Let's talk. They sat under the tree. Colin asked, What work do you do in the gardens? Whatever I'm told, Ben replied. Kept on 'cause she liked me. She? Thou mother, this was her garden, Colin said softly. Aye, said Ben. She were fond of it. Well, it's mine now, and it's a secret. You must tell no one. Ben smiled. "Aye, sir. I'll know how to keep quiet." "I thought no one had been here for 10 years, Colin said. Ben chuckled. "I come over the wall once a year, did a bit of pruning. She'd asked me to look after her roses." Colin smiled. "I'm glad you did. You'll help us now too." On the grass, Colin spotted Mary's trowel. He picked it up. Slowly, with effort, he turned a patch of soil. "You said I'd dig," he told Dickon. "Well, here I am," Dickon grinned. "Thought a Yorkshire lad for sure." Ben nodded. "Let's plant the rose, quickly." Dickon dug a hole. Mary fetched water. Ben brought a rose from the greenhouse. Colin set it into the earth, flushed and determined. "It's planted," he said, "and the sun's still up. Help me stand, Dickon." And when the sun slipped below the edge, Colin was on his feet, standing, smiling, triumphant. Dr. Craven had been waiting at the house for some time. When Colin returned, he looked him over carefully. "You stayed too long," he said. "You mustn't overexert." "I'm not tired," Colin replied. "Tomorrow, I'll go out in the morning too. I don't know that I can allow that." "It would not be wise to try and stop me," Colin said. Even Mary had noticed. Colin never realized just how rude he was. He had always been the ruler of his own little island, and no one had ever taught him otherwise. But Mary, having learned her own lessons, decided to help him see. "I feel sorry for Dr. Craven," she said. "So do I. He won't get Misselthwaite now that I'm not dying," Colin said smugly. "I mean, it must have been horrid to be polite for 10 years to a rude boy. Am I rude?" "Yes," Mary said honestly. "So am I. So is Ben Weatherstaff. But we're getting better. I don't want to be rude. I want to be strong." "You will be," Mary said. Colin grew thoughtful. "The garden has magic. Good magic. I know it. So do I. They always called it magic now. And truly, what else could explain the change?" Every day, green things grew. Buds opened. Petals unfurled. Colour spread across the garden in waves of purple, blue, crimson. Flowers grew from cracks in the wall. Roses wound around the sundial, trees and trellises. Life bloomed. Colin watched everything. He learned about beetles, frogs, squirrels, birds. He watched a mole dig its way up from the earth. He studied the roots and leaves, amazed. "There must be magic in everything," he said. "We just don't know how to use it yet. But I'm going to learn. I'm going to try an experiment." The next day, he stood tall beneath a tree, facing Mary, Dickon, and Ben. "I'm going to be a scientist," he said. "And this is my experiment. Magic is real. It is inside us. I'm going to say so every day until it makes me strong." He turned to Ben. "Will you help?" "Aye, sir." Ben nodded. Colin smiled. "Then let's begin. We'll sit under the tree and chant." So they did. Ben grumbled about rheumatics, but joined them. The animals gathered quietly. Even Soot the crow perched nearby, and Colin began. "The sun is shining. That is magic. The flowers are growing. That is magic. Being alive is magic. Magic is in me. It is in me. It is in all of us." He said it again and again. Mary was spellbound. Dickon smiled. Ben dozed a little, then woke up gruffly. "I'm going to walk around the garden," Colin announced. Ben grunted. "Let's see thee then." And Colin walked, slowly, with rests, supported by Dickon. But he walked. By the end, his cheeks glowed. "I did it!" he cried. "The magic worked. This is my first discovery." "What will Dr. Craven say?" Mary gasped. "He won't know," Colin said. "Not yet. No one will. When father returns, I'll walk into his study and say, I'm well now. I'm like other boys. The experiment worked. Mary laughed. He'll think it's a dream. One day, Colin said, I'll be an athlete. Thar might win the prize fight in belt. Ben joked. Don't be disrespectful, Colin warned. But he smiled. The sun dipped lower. The magic lingered. The next morning, Colin was up with the sun. He called for Dickon and Mary at once. Today, he declared, we take the long walk. They agreed. The path stretched far beyond the garden, circling through hedgerows and along the edge of the moor. Colin walked. Not far, not fast, but he walked. At first, they met no one. But near the rose borders, 2 gardeners passed. One of them stopped and stared. That was that Master Colin, he asked. The other dropped his trowel. He's walking, on his own 2 feet. Looks like he's grown a full inch already, the first whispered. Tell no one, Mary said firmly, stepping between them and Colin. It's a secret. The men nodded, but soon the whole staff knew. That afternoon, from the kitchen to the stable yard, servants whispered and speculated. He's cured, they said. He's up and walking. Martha nearly dropped a tray. I said he'd get well, didn't I? Didn't I say? Susan Sowerby smiled when she heard. Let them whisper, she said. Let them laugh. It's what children are meant to do, and so they did. Every day, Colin walked farther. Every day, the garden glowed greener. Every day, the laughter echoed louder. And still, the secret held. No one knew, not officially, but the magic was out in the world now, and it could not be stopped. It was a morning like none before. The sky was a soft blue. The moor beyond the garden shimmered in a golden haze, and the robin sang so loudly it sounded like he was announcing a holiday. Colin stood at the ivy door, no chair, no crutches, just Dickon's hand holding his for a moment. He took a deep breath, stepped through the arch, and walked into the garden alone. Mary clapped her hands. Tha's done it, Colin beamed. I'm not afraid. They had known this day would come. The day Colin walked unassisted. The day he claimed the garden. The day he felt the magic in every step. I feel like the garden is mine, he said. Not just because it was my mother's, but because I helped make it alive again. They walked together, the 3 of them, from the roses to the sundial, past beds full of pansies and poppies, beneath blossoming trees. Birds sang, squirrels chased each other, the air buzzed with bees and joy. They laughed, they ran, they played. Even Colin ran now awkwardly, yes, but freely. Ben Weatherstaff peeked in through a gap in the wall. Bless me, he murmured. Look at that lad go. That afternoon, they rested beneath the tree canopy. Colin pulled a notebook from his pocket. I've begun a book, he said. The scientific discoveries of Colin Craven. Mary giggled. Is magic on page 1? It is, Colin said proudly. And nature on page 2. And friendship on page 3. Dickon nodded. That's a good start. As the sun climbed high, they were quiet for a while, just breathing, just listening. And then Colin said, I'm going to bring father here. Mary looked at him. To the garden? Yes. Not yet. But when I'm ready, when I can run to him, I want him to see me not as he feared I'd be, but as I am. Mary reached for his hand. He'll be proud. I hope so, Colin whispered. I'll make sure of it. And above them the robin sang on loud and bright, as if he already knew how the story would end. It was a morning like none before. The sky was a soft blue. The moor beyond the garden shimmered in a golden haze, and the robin sang so loudly it sounded like he was announcing a holiday. Colin stood at the ivy door, no chair, no crutches, just Dickon's hand holding his for a moment. He took a deep breath, stepped through the arch, and walked into the garden alone. Mary clapped her hands. "Tha's done it." Colin beamed. "I'm not afraid." They had known this day would come. The day Colin walked unassisted. The day he claimed the garden. The day he felt the magic in every step. "I feel like the garden is mine," he said. "Not just because it was my mother's, but because I helped make it alive again." They walked together, the three of them, from the roses to the sundial, past beds full of pansies and poppies, beneath blossoming trees. Birds sang, squirrels chased each other, the air buzzed with bees and joy. They laughed, they ran, they played. Even Colin ran now awkwardly, yes, but freely. Ben Weatherstaff peeked in through a gap in the wall. "Bless me," he murmured. "Look at that lad go." That afternoon, they rested beneath the tree canopy. Colin pulled a notebook from his pocket. "I've begun a book," he said. "The Scientific Discoveries of Colin Craven." Mary giggled. "Is magic on page 1? "It is," Colin said proudly. "And nature on page 2. And friendship on page 3. Dickon nodded. "That's a good start." As the sun climbed high, they were quiet for a while, just breathing, just listening. And then Colin said, "I'm going to bring Father here." Mary looked at him. "To the garden?" "Yes. Not yet. But when I'm ready, when I can run to him, I want him to see me not as he feared I'd be, but as I am." Mary reached for his hand. "He'll be proud." "I hope so," Colin whispered. "I'll make sure of it." And above them the robin sang on loud and bright, as if he already knew how the story would end. Each morning, after their magic ceremony beneath the tree, Colin grew more determined. He spoke with purpose, like a scientist preparing to reveal a great discovery. "Magic," he declared, "must be worked with movement." So he walked, stretched, dug, and observed every plant, bird, and breeze. One morning, as sunlight bathed the garden in gold, he rose suddenly and spread his arms. His face glowed. "I'm well," he shouted. "I shall live forever and ever and ever." Ben Weatherstaff, kneeling beside a rosebush, grunted. "If thou can shout that, thou might as well sing it. Ever hear the doxology, lad?" "No," said Colin. Dickon grinned. "It's a hymn. I'll teach thee." And so in the secret garden, under the sky, they sang, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." Colin liked the words. Maybe magic and God are the same thing, he mused. We don't know the name of everything. Ben wiped his eye roughly. "Sing it again." They did. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped inside, tall, strong, with kind blue eyes and a face that glowed with warmth and wisdom. Mary gasped. "Mother!" cried Dickon. Susan Sowerby opened her arms. Mary ran to her. Dickon followed. Colin stood frozen. "You're Dickon's mother?" he asked. She smiled. "Aye, and I've wanted to meet thee, Master Colin." He took a shy step forward. "I hoped you would come." She walked toward him. "And here I am." Ben stood and tipped his cap. "Well now, Susan, thou's come to see the finest miracle this garden's ever grown." She looked at Colin, tall, straight, strong. "Aye," she whispered. "He's his mother's son." Colin beamed. She turned to Mary. "And thee why? There's bloomin' like a rose in June, just like thy mother before thee." Mary blushed. Susan walked through the garden, touching leaves, breathing deeply. "There's joy here," she said softly. "Real joy. Magic or no, it's life." They talked of future plans. Colin wanted to visit her cottage. Mary begged to meet the 12 Sowerby children. They imagined picnics and fires, potatoes roasted under moorland stars. When it was time for her to leave, Colin took her hand. "I wish you were my mother too," he said. Susan knelt and kissed his forehead. "Thy own mother's in this very garden. She never left thee, lad." Colin's eyes shone. She turned to go, but not before whispering, "And thy father, he'll come back. He must." Colin watched her go, heart full. The garden glowed around him, and he felt it in every breath. Joy, love, and magic, the best magic of all. The sky over Misselthwaite stretched wide and blue. Birds soared. The wind carried scents of heather and earth. And Colin Craven, once a pale, angry shadow of a boy, walked through the garden gate, not hidden, not carried, but walking. "We go outside today," he had declared that morning. "Beyond the walls, no more secrets." Mary's eyes sparkled. "Let's surprise them." So, Dickon fetched a cap for Colin, one of his own, and Colin wore it proudly. "Now I'm one of you," he said, "a Yorkshire lad." Out through the kitchen gardens they went, down paths lined with violets and daffodils. They passed a group of servants, and one dropped her basket. "Master Colin?" she gasped. He smiled. "Good morning." By the time they reached the terrace, word had flown through the manor, like a bird through open windows. The boy was walking. At the front steps, Mrs. Medlock nearly fainted. "Well, I never. It's magic," said Mary. "Or science," added Colin, grinning. "We're not quite sure." That afternoon, in a sunlit room, a letter was written. Colin's own hand, steady and bold. "Father, I am well. Come home. Colin." Outside, the moor rolled on, endless and bright. And Misselthwaite Manor, once quiet with sorrow, now sang with laughter, because the garden had opened, and so had a boy's heart. Years later, people still spoke of the transformation at Misselthwaite, but for Mary, Colin, and Dickon, the greatest secret was not the roses or the key hidden in the earth. It was the discovery that inside every heart there is a locked garden, waiting. Some walls are built from grief, some from anger, some from loneliness, but the walls can be broken. With patience, with kindness, with courage, life can bloom again. Colin's first step, Mary's first kindness, Dickon's first smile, these were the seeds, and the garden answered. It always does. The secret garden was never only a place of vines and blossoms. It was proof that when love is tended, when joy is allowed to grow, the heart itself becomes a sanctuary. And so, when you next walk among flowers or hear the wind move through the trees, perhaps you will remember there is magic everywhere, not in spells, but in life itself. In every seed, every breath, every quiet act of care. That is the truest secret garden of all. Thank you for joining me in the secret garden today. If you also love literary stories and want to continue other interesting adventures, please click subscribe and turn on the notification bell. See you in the next story. Wishing you peace and joy.